The station was enormous. It floated in deep space like a metal city, full of lights, humming engines, and the smell of 100 different alien worlds. Sergeant Marcus Hale stood at the entrance ramp with a single bag over his shoulder and looked up at it. He took a slow breath. Then he walked inside. His orders were simple. He had been assigned as a security attaché aboard the Velthari Imperial Star Station, a place called Vel-Cathor. It was the most important diplomatic station in the known galaxy. The Velthari Empire ran it, and the Velthari were not exactly excited to have a human on board. Nobody was. Marcus knew that before he even arrived. Humans had only recently been allowed into the Galactic Accord, the big alliance of alien species that ran most of the known galaxy. They were allowed in not because anyone respected them. They were allowed in because it was politically useful. Humans were small, short-lived, and physically weak compared to most alien races. That was the general opinion, and almost every species held it without question. The Velthari were the worst about it. They were tall. Most of them stood nearly 8 feet. Their skin was thick and layered, almost like natural armor. They lived for hundreds of years. Their soldiers trained from childhood and could take wounds that would kill 3 humans without slowing down. To them, Marcus was not a soldier. He was barely a curiosity. He found his post on the lower security deck. It was a small room with a desk, a monitor, and a view of a docking corridor that saw almost no traffic. It was the kind of post they gave someone they wanted to forget about. Marcus looked at the room for a moment. Then he sat down, pulled out his personal notepad, and started reading the station layout files he had downloaded before arrival. He read everything: floor plans, ventilation systems, guard rotation schedules, emergency lockdown procedures, docking bay logs going back 6 months. He read until his eyes were tired. Then he slept 4 hours and read some more. That was how Marcus worked. He had always been like that. His trainers back on Earth used to say he had the brain of a man who expected everything to go wrong. Marcus never argued with that. He just said it was good practice. His official supervisor on the station was Senior Guard Commander Zarothan. The commander was everything a Velthari soldier was supposed to be. Huge, decorated, and completely unimpressed by Marcus. Their first meeting lasted less than 3 minutes. Zarothan looked him up and down, the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they didn't order. "You are the human attaché," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "You will monitor the lower docking corridors. You will file daily reports. You will not interfere with active Velthari security operations." He paused. "Your kind bleeds from things we barely feel. You should not be here." Marcus met his eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Then I'll make sure nothing here makes me bleed." Zarothan stared at him. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The other aliens on the station were not much different. The Velthari guards ignored him in the hallways. The diplomatic staff from other species looked at him with polite pity. A group of lure scientists passed him once, near the observation deck, and one of them whispered something to the others that made them laugh quietly. Marcus kept walking. He did his job. Every day. He watched the corridors. He filed his reports. He talked to the maintenance workers, many of whom were from smaller, less powerful species, and were used to being ignored too. They were usually happy to chat. Marcus listened carefully. He learned which docking bays got used at odd hours. He learned which supply routes were checked less frequently. He learned the names of the cleaning staff and which sections of the station the senior guards never personally inspected. Most of this information sat in his reports, which nobody read. Then came the announcement of the diplomatic summit. 12 delegations from 12 different species would be arriving at Vel-Cathor within the week. It was a major event. The station buzzed with preparation. New security protocols were drawn up by Zarothan's team. Decoration crews hung banners in the main hall. The docking bays were cleaned and inspected. Marcus watched all of it carefully. And then, during one of his routine reviews of the docking registry, he found something wrong. It was small, easy to miss. A cargo shipment listed under the name of a mid-level trade delegation had arrived 11 minutes ahead of its scheduled window. That didn't sound like much. But Marcus had been reading docking logs for weeks. Cargo shipments didn't arrive early. They arrived late, or exactly on time. Early arrivals meant someone had moved fast to get there, and people only moved fast when they didn't want to be noticed at normal hours. He cross-referenced the shipment against the delegation's listed inventory. Everything matched on paper, but the weight of the shipment was slightly off from what was declared. Only by a few units, easy to overlook. Marcus wrote it all up in a detailed report. He flagged it as a potential security concern. He sent it up the chain to Zarothan's office. He got no response. He sent a follow-up the next morning. Still nothing. He considered going in person to the commander's office. He thought about it for a long time, sitting at his small desk in his small room, looking at the docking corridor through his monitor. He knew what would happen. Zarothan would look at him the way he always looked at him. He would say something about human anxiety. He would dismiss the concern. But Marcus had learned something a long time ago. Doing the right thing didn't always feel powerful. Sometimes it just felt like talking into empty air. You did it anyway. He sent the report a second time with an additional note. He explained his reasoning line by line, as clearly as he could, with no extra words. He ended it simply, recommend physical inspection of Shipment Bay 7C before Summit Day. Then he went back to watching the corridors. It was 2 days before the summit that he finally saw her. Empress Velsora moved through the station like everything around her was standing still out of respect. She was tall, even by Velthari standards, with silver-gray skin and dark eyes that missed nothing. Her honor guard surrounded her in a tight formation. The diplomatic staff parted like water. Marcus stood at his post near the corridor junction as the procession passed. He was still, professional. He did not look away, but he did not stare either. He simply watched, the way he watched everything. For just a moment as she passed, the Empress glanced at him. It was a short look, the kind you give something unfamiliar that you are not sure what to make of. Not unkind, just uncertain, like she was filing him away somewhere in her mind for later. Then she was gone, and the corridor was quiet again. Marcus turned back to his monitor. The docking logs were still open on the screen. Shipment Bay 7C, 11 minutes early, weight discrepancy. Nobody had checked it yet. He looked at the date on the screen. Summit Day was in 48 hours. He picked up his notepad and started writing again. The morning of the summit was loud and busy in a way that made most people stop paying attention to small details. That was the problem. Delegations arrived through 3 separate docking bays. Hundreds of aliens filled the station corridors. Diplomats in formal robes, assistants carrying data tablets, security escorts from a dozen different worlds, and maintenance crews rushing to make sure every light was bright and every floor was clean. The main hall had been decorated overnight. Long banners in Vilthari gold hung from the ceiling. The air smelled of something floral and expensive. Marcus stood at his post and watched all of it, and the feeling in his stomach did not go away. He had learned a long time ago not to argue with that feeling. On Earth, during his early training, one of his instructors had told him, "Your brain notices things before your mouth can explain them. Trust the gap." Right now, the gap between what his brain was noticing and what he could clearly explain was very large, but it was there. He watched the delegations as they moved through the corridors toward the main hall. Most of the diplomats moved the way diplomats always moved, slowly, with ceremony, looking at everything around them with polite interest. They shook hands with station officials. They exchanged small gifts. They paused for conversation. Normal things. But one group moved differently. They were listed in the station registry as a trade delegation from a small outer system called Velthun Minor. 7 members. They had arrived with the cargo shipment Marcus had flagged, the one in Bay 7C, the one that was 11 minutes early and slightly too heavy. Their paperwork was perfect. Their uniforms were correct. Their faces were calm. Too calm. Marcus had spent weeks watching aliens move through this station. Most species, even confident ones, showed something when they were in an unfamiliar place. Small movements, quick glances at signage, a slight hesitation at corridor junctions. These 7 showed none of that. They moved like they had already memorized the route, like they had walked it before, in their heads, many times. He kept his face neutral and looked down at his tablet. He pulled up the delegation's file again. Velthun Minor was a quiet trading world. No military history. No political significance. There was no obvious reason for a delegation from there to attend a summit of this level. Their listed purpose was to discuss minor export agreements. He wrote another short note and sent it to Zarothan's office. He already knew the answer he would get. 5 minutes later, a junior Velthari aide sent back a single line. Delegation has been cleared through standard protocol. No action required. He looked at the corridor. The 7 delegates had already moved deeper into the station toward the main hall. He thought about following them. He thought about what Zarothan would say if he did. A human attaché from the lower decks, ignoring his post, following a clear delegation based on a feeling. He stayed at his post. But he pulled up the live security feed for the main hall on his monitor, and did not look away from it. The summit began on schedule. Empress Velsora entered the main hall to a low, formal tone of Velthari ceremony. Every delegation rose. The hall was packed with dignitaries, guards, and station staff. Zarothan stood at the head of his security team, arms folded, completely composed. He had 30 elite guards positioned throughout the hall. He had, by every standard of galactic security protocol, done everything correctly. What he had not done, what none of the Velthari security team had done, was think about what the sensor arrays might miss. The sensors were calibrated for weapons, for energy signatures, for the specific chemical markers of known explosive compounds. They were very good at finding those things. The Velthari had designed them, and the Velthari were very good at designing things for Velthari threats. They had not thought to calibrate for a biologically targeted neurotoxin aerosolized in a container that mimicked the chemical signature of the floral air freshener used throughout the station that morning. The device was inside one of the decorative column bases on the left side of the hall. It had been placed there during the overnight decoration shift, inside a sealed unit that looked exactly like the support brackets used on every other column. The people who placed it had timed the release for exactly 12 minutes into the opening ceremony, when the Empress would be at the podium, when the hall would be at maximum capacity, and when every guard would be in a fixed ceremonial position. The toxin was designed for Velthari biology. Dense-bodied species with layered skin absorbed it fast through respiration. It didn't kill, it dropped. Muscles first, then balance, then consciousness, in about 90 seconds. Clean and quiet. Marcus had no way of knowing any of this exactly. He just knew something was wrong. On his monitor, he watched the ceremony begin. He watched the Empress move to the podium. He watched the delegates settle. He watched the 7 people from Velthun Minor stand in a cluster near the left side of the hall, close to one of the large decorative columns. He stood up from his desk. He told himself he was going to walk past the hall entrance and take a closer look. That was all. He was not going to cause a scene. He was not going to interrupt a summit of 12 civilizations because of a feeling. He was halfway down the corridor when the sound hit him. It was not an explosion. It was more like a soft, deep hiss, something releasing under pressure, It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then came the sounds he would remember for the rest of his life. Not shouting, not alarms, just the heavy, terrible thuds of large bodies hitting the floor, one after another. Like a sound effect, someone was playing too slowly. He ran. He hit the entrance to the main hall and saw it all in 1 second. Zarothan was on his knees, one massive hand pressed to the floor, trying to hold himself up, and failing. 24 Veilthari guards were already down. The diplomatic staff from other species were stumbling, confused. The toxin was hitting Veilthari biology fastest, but the general panic was taking everyone else down too. People were falling over each other. Screaming had started now. And across the hall, the 7 delegates from Velthun Minor were moving. They had shed their diplomatic robes. Underneath, they wore close-fitted tactical gear. They were armed. They were calm. They were moving in a clean, practiced formation directly toward the podium where Empress Velsora was standing. She had not fallen, but she was swaying. One hand gripped the edge of the podium. Her guards were on the floor around her. Marcus felt the edges of his own vision blur. The toxin was in the air, and his body was catching it too. Slower than the Veilthari, much slower, but catching it. His ears were ringing. He looked across the hall at 7 armed, trained killers walking toward the most powerful ruler in the known galaxy. He did not stop to think about the odds. He moved. The first thing Marcus did was not heroic. It was practical. He grabbed a fallen Veilthari guard's weapon from the floor as he ran. A long, heavy sidearm, built for hands much bigger than his. And he fired it at the ceiling above the kill team. Not at them, above them. The shot hit a lighting panel and brought a cascade of sparks and broken glass raining down onto the group. It didn't hurt them. It stopped them for 2 seconds, made them flinch and scatter slightly, broke their tight formation. 2 seconds was what he needed. He reached the Empress before they reformed. He grabbed her arm and pulled. She was heavier than she looked. All Veilthari were. But she moved. He got her off the podium and behind it in one rough motion, using the thick base as cover. Not good cover, but something. "Stay down," he said. She looked at him, even half-conscious from the toxin. Her eyes were sharp. She dropped low behind the podium base. The kill team came around both sides. There were 7 of them. Drekal mercenaries, Marcus realized. He recognized the build now. 4 arms each, nearly 7 feet tall. The kind of species that hired out as muscle across the outer systems because they were genuinely biologically built for violence. Each one of them was worth 3 Veilthari in a straight fight. He was one human with a borrowed weapon, a ringing head, and legs that felt like they were slowly filling with wet sand. The first one came around the left side of the podium fast. Marcus didn't try to fight him cleanly. He dropped low, drove his shoulder into the mercenary's knee joint, the weakest point on a Drekal, and pushed sideways with everything he had. The mercenary went off balance. Marcus came up and hit him across the face with the butt of the heavy sidearm. The impact traveled up his arms, like hitting a metal post. The mercenary stumbled, but didn't fall. Marcus was already moving. He knew staying still was death. He used the podium, the overturned chairs, the bodies of unconscious guards. Everything in the hall became part of how he moved. He had memorized the layout of this room. He knew where the support columns were. He knew the distance from the podium to the emergency side door. He knew the weak points in the room's geometry, even if he hadn't known what he'd need them for. The mercenaries were good, they were disciplined, and they did not panic. But they were used to targets that tried to run, or targets that stood and fought. Marcus did neither. He moved like water in a broken pipe, always somewhere slightly different from where they expected. He took a hit to the ribs that he felt immediately and deeply. One of the 4 armed mercenaries caught him across the side as he turned, and the blow lifted him slightly off his feet and threw him 2 meters into a row of chairs. He landed badly. He lay there for a moment with his ears ringing and the ceiling lights blurring above him. Get up. He got up. His vision was narrowing at the edges. The toxin, the hit, the physical effort, all of it was adding up. He could feel his body sending him very clear signals about the situation. He ignored them the way he had always ignored them. Pain was information, not instructions. He pulled himself behind a column. 2 mercenaries came from different angles at the same time. Smart. They were adapting. He waited until the last moment, let one of them come around the column first, and used the column itself to redirect the mercenaries' momentum. The alien's own forward charge helped send him crashing into the second one. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Marcus was on the first one immediately. He used the weight of the sidearm. He was not strong enough to knock a Drekall unconscious with clean technique, so he didn't try. He hit the joint where the neck met the armor plating. Once, twice, 3 times. Fast and without hesitation. The mercenary stopped moving. He turned. 4 left. One of them had circled back toward the podium. No, Marcus said, and he ran. The mercenary heard him coming and turned, raising a weapon. Marcus threw the sidearm at his face, not because it would work perfectly, but because it made the mercenary bring his arms up to block, and crashed into him low, inside the weapon's reach where it couldn't fire safely. He grabbed the weapon arm with both hands and twisted, using gravity and his own falling body weight to wrench it sideways. Then, the mercenary threw him off, and Marcus hit the floor hard. He lay there on his back, looking up. The mercenary stood over him. It was a big alien. 4 arms, thick body, completely composed. It looked down at Marcus the way something looks at a problem it is almost finished solving. Then it raised one of its feet to end it simply. Marcus rolled. The foot came down where his head was. He rolled the other way, got a hand under himself, and came up to 1 knee. He was breathing hard. His side was screaming at him. His hands were shaking slightly from the toxin working through his blood. The mercenary looked at him. There was something in its expression that Marcus read as confusion. Not fear, just genuine confusion. "Why are you still moving?" it said. Its translator crackled slightly on the words. Marcus spat blood from where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek in one of the falls. He looked the mercenary in the eyes. He didn't answer. He just came forward again. Later, people who reviewed the security footage would spend a long time on this particular moment. Not because of what happened next, though what happened next was remarkable, but because of that moment itself. One human, clearly already hurt, clearly struggling, making the choice to walk back into it without hesitation or drama, like it was simply the only option that existed. The fight went on. Marcus didn't win cleanly. He won the way someone wins when they simply refuse to be finished. He took hits he shouldn't have been standing after. He used the environment, the timing, the angles, anything that wasn't his own body, because his body was running out of what it could give. He drove one mercenary into a wall column at full running speed. He used a chair as a weapon when he had nothing else. He bit, he scratched. He fought without any pride at all, and that complete lack of pride was what kept him alive, because he never stopped to recover or position himself properly. He just kept going. When the last 2 mercenaries still standing finally pulled back toward the hall's main entrance, weighing the mission against what this was costing them, Marcus was standing between them and the Empress's position. His left arm was hanging at a wrong angle. His breathing was loud. He was bleeding from his head, his side, and one hand. He did not move from the spot. They looked at him. He looked at them. Then the station's emergency alarm finally broke through the ceiling speakers, loud and red, and the sound of reinforcement boots came hammering down the outer corridor, heavy, fast, and many. The two remaining mercenaries ran. Marcus turned around slowly and walked back to the side door of the hall, the one that led to the sealed emergency chamber he had guided the Empress to during the fight. He sat down with his back against the wall beside the door. He put his good hand over the worst of the bleeding on his side. He pressed hard. He was not going to lose consciousness. Not yet. Not until he knew she was safe. The reinforcement team hit the hall in under 40 seconds. They fanned out. They secured the room. They found 5 mercenaries down. 2 dead. 3 unconscious. They found the device in the column base. They found 31 Velthari guards beginning to slowly wake up from the floor. And they found 1 human sitting in the corridor outside a sealed door. Very still, very pale, eyes open, watching the entrance. The team leader moved toward him. Marcus looked up. "Empress is inside," Marcus said. His voice was steady. "She's alive. Don't open the door until she confirms your voice." The team leader stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and did exactly what Marcus said. The medical bay on Velcathor was built for Velthari bodies. The beds were too long. The equipment was scaled for patients twice Marcus's size. A Velthari nurse had to reroute 2 different monitoring devices just to get them to fit correctly around a human chest. She did it without complaint, but she kept glancing at him with an expression he recognized, the same look people gave him when he did something they didn't have a framework for. He had 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated left shoulder, a deep laceration along his side, a mild concussion, and early-stage toxin exposure that his body had apparently been burning through on its own the whole time. The Velthari doctor who treated him went quiet halfway through the assessment, and stayed quiet. Marcus didn't ask why. He could guess. He slept for 11 hours. When he woke up, Zarothan was in the next bed. The commander was sitting upright, or trying to. The toxin had hit him hard, the way it hit every large-bodied Velthari, and even now his movements were slower than usual. He looked diminished in a way that clearly bothered him. When Marcus stirred, Zarothan turned his head and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Marcus said nothing either. He reached for the water beside his bed and drank it. Finally, Zarothan spoke. "I received your reports," he said. "I know," Marcus said. "I did not act on them." "I know that too." The commander was quiet. Whatever he was going to say next, it was taking him a long time to find the words. 31 of my guards went down in the first 90 seconds, he said finally. Trained soldiers, the best in the Empire. He looked at his own hands, as if checking that they worked. You were the only security personnel still standing. I got lucky with the toxin, Marcus said. It wasn't built for humans. That is not the only reason, Zarothan said. Marcus didn't argue. The commander looked at the ceiling. How did you keep moving? After the first hit, after the second. Our doctors reviewed your injuries. They say you were fighting with a dislocated shoulder and 2 cracked ribs for most of the last half of the engagement. He paused. How does a human do that? Marcus thought about it for a moment. He wasn't being modest. He genuinely had to think about how to explain it. We have a thing, he said. When something is important enough, we decide it's not going to stop us, and then it just doesn't. It's not special. Every human does it. Zarothan stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. The news had already spread across the galaxy by the time Marcus woke up, faster than anyone on the station had expected. The Velcathor Summit Hall had been full of recording equipment for the diplomatic event. The security cameras had caught everything in clear, unedited footage. Someone, no one ever officially confirmed who, had transmitted a copy of the footage to the open galactic news networks before the station's communications were locked down for the investigation. The reaction was enormous. The footage showed 31 elite Vialthari guards dropping in seconds. It showed one human running toward the threat instead of away from it. It showed 7 large, armed professional mercenaries fighting one human for almost 4 minutes and failing to put him down permanently. It showed the human sitting calmly outside the sealed door afterward, bleeding, giving instructions to the response team. Every major news network in the Accord was running the story. The headline formats varied by species, but the question at the center of all of them was the same. What exactly are humans? Military analysts who had previously filed humans under low threat, low capability were suddenly doing very public revisions. Xenobiologists were pulling old research on human pain tolerance, adrenaline response, and psychological stress endurance. The numbers had been there for years. Nobody had thought they were meaningful before. Now everyone was reading them very carefully. A professor from the Lure Collective Science Academy gave a live interview in which she said, with visible discomfort, that her institution's previous classification of humans as a biologically fragile species had been based on surface measurements. We measured their physical limits, she said. We never measured what they do when they reach those limits. Those are, it turns out, very different things. The separatists who had organized the assassination were quickly identified. A faction of Vialthari hardliners who opposed the Empress's more open policies toward other species. The allied alien empire that had funded the Drakal mercenaries was named within 48 hours. 3 ambassadors were recalled. 2 alliances collapsed. 1 minor empire formally apologized to the Vialthari Empire and Earth's government on the same day, which was an event that had no historical precedent. Through all of it, Marcus lay in a medical bay bed and read his reports. On the 3rd day, the door to the medical bay opened and Empress Velsora walked in. She came without ceremony. She had 2 guards at the door, which for a Vialthari Empress was practically informal, and she walked to Marcus's bedside and stood there, and looked at him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. She raised one hand, slightly, and he stopped. "You filed reports," she said. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Twice?" "3 times, actually." Something moved in her expression. It wasn't quite a smile. "I read them," she said. "After, all 3. She looked at him steadily. "You saw what my entire security apparatus missed." "I had more time to look," Marcus said, "and less to do. It's easier to notice things when nobody expects much from you." She was quiet for a moment. "You are not what I expected a human to be," she said. "Most people aren't what they're expected to be," Marcus said, "if anyone actually takes the time to look." It was a bold thing to say to an empress. He knew that. But she didn't seem offended. She looked at him for another moment, and then she did something that no record in Vialthari imperial history noted her ever doing with a non-Vialthari. She inclined her head. Formal and genuine. "I am in your debt, Sergeant Hale," she said. "The Empire is in your debt." Marcus held her gaze and answered the only way that felt honest to him. "I was doing my job, Your Majesty. That's all it was." She studied him one more time. Then she turned and left. The investigation took 3 more weeks. The station went through complete security overhauls. The summit was rescheduled. Zarothan submitted a formal internal report, in which he included a full accounting of the security failure. And, in a passage that became widely read, he specifically cited the dismissal of Marcus's reports as a primary contributing factor to the near success of the assassination. He named himself responsible. He also, in the final paragraph, made a formal recommendation for the creation of a joint human Vialthari security review process on all future diplomatic operations. It was the kind of thing that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. On the last day before Marcus's medical release, a formal message arrived from the Imperial Palace. It was sealed with the Empress's personal mark. It declared in language that had not been used for a non-Veilthari in all of recorded Veilthari history, that Sergeant Marcus Hale was to be named Shieldkin of the Empress, a title belonging to the oldest and most trusted line of Imperial protectors. Marcus read the message twice. He folded it carefully. He set it on the small table beside his bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he picked up his notepad and started writing a formal request for his next assignment. He made it short. The months that followed were strange for the galaxy. Not dramatic in the way the attack had been, not loud or sudden. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of a very large number of very intelligent species going back through their records and realizing they had been wrong about something important for a very long time. On Earth, the news hit differently than anywhere else. There were no parades. Humans were not, as a species, particularly given to celebrating the idea that they were capable of surviving hard things. They already knew that. They had always known that. What they felt, mostly, was the particular satisfaction of being seen, finally, by people who had spent a long time looking the other way. The diplomatic offices in Geneva received 312 new requests for formal meetings with human representatives in the 6 weeks following the Velcathor incident. 17 species who had previously declined to open full embassy relations with Earth reversed their positions. 2 of them sent written apologies along with their requests, which was considered remarkable and was discussed at length by people who studied these things. The Valthari Empire moved fastest. The joint military exchange program that Empress Valsora had proposed was in early planning stages before Marcus had even left the medical bay. Valthari military advisors arrived on Earth within 2 months. Human security consultants were placed aboard 3 major Valthari stations within 4. It was not a sudden friendship. There were still old attitudes on both sides, old habits of assumption that took time to unlearn. But it was real, and it was moving in a direction that nobody would have predicted a year before. The question that kept appearing in news discussions and academic papers and political speeches across the Accord was the same one, asked in 100 different ways. How did we miss this? The xenobiologist from the Lure Collective who had spoken on the news, Professor Yen Rotha, published a full paper 3 months after the incident. It was titled simply, On the Misclassification of Homo sapiens as a Fragile Species. It was long, careful, and filled with data that had been sitting in various scientific databases for years, without anyone thinking it was particularly significant. She laid it out plainly. Human bodies were smaller. Human bones broke more easily under direct impact. Humans had no natural armor, no redundant organs in the Veilthari sense, shorter lifespans, and no biological weapon of any kind. None of it, she argued, told you anything useful about what a human would actually do in a crisis. What the data showed, when you looked at it correctly, was a species that had evolved on a planet that was genuinely trying to kill it. Through weather, through predators, through disease, through the environment itself, and had survived anyway. Not by becoming physically powerful, by becoming something else. By developing a relationship with pain and fear and exhaustion that no other known species had. Humans did not avoid suffering in the way that most species did. They processed it, worked through it, and kept going with a consistency that the paper described as, biologically speaking, without known parallel in the surveyed galaxy. The conclusion of the paper was read aloud in the Galactic Accord Grand Chamber during a special session on human relations. The concluding line was simple. We measured what humans could not survive. We never measured what they could. These are not the same question. The Grand Chamber session was long and in places uncomfortable. Representatives from species who had publicly dismissed humanity stood at their podiums and said things that were difficult to say. Some did it gracefully. Some did it mechanically because politics required it. One delegate from a species that had maintained a public position for decades, that humans were too fragile to be considered for full security partnership in the Accord, stood up and said, with no particular grace, but at least with honesty, "We were afraid of the wrong things about them." Humanity's representative, an older woman named Director Yael Osman, who had been in galactic diplomacy for 30 years and had the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time, listened to all of it without visible emotion. When it was her turn to speak, she said very little. She thanked the chamber for the session. She noted that humans looked forward to working more closely with their Accord partners. She sat down. People who knew her said that was the most satisfied they had ever seen her look. Across the galaxy, other changes were happening more quietly. Species that had never considered requesting human medical researchers began doing so. It turned out that a species which had evolved fighting its own biology for millennia had developed a particularly creative approach to medicine. Human architects were suddenly in demand on 3 different worlds for reasons that took a while to understand. Humans, who had always built things expecting them to be stressed and damaged, designed structures with a kind of built-in resilience that other species hadn't thought to prioritize. Human psychologists were requested by 2 alien military organizations who wanted to understand the specific mental quality that let a person keep functioning under conditions that should, by every measurement, have broken them. The galaxy, it turned out, had a great deal to learn from the species it had spent so long ignoring. Marcus Hale learned about most of this secondhand. He was not in Geneva for the diplomatic sessions. He was not at the Grand Chamber when the paper was read. He had declined 14 separate requests for interviews, 6 offers of prestigious appointments, and 1 invitation to a formal dinner hosted by a species that had previously refused to acknowledge humans as significant in any political sense. His formal request for reassignment had been approved. He was back in the field, a frontier security post on the edge of Accord-mapped space, the kind of assignment that most people considered too unglamorous and too far from the political center to be worth having. Marcus considered it exactly right. He ate his meals alone, or with whatever local staff happened to be around. He read station logs. He walked corridors. He filed careful reports that were, slowly, starting to get responses. He heard about the final treaty signing from a brief message sent by a contact at the diplomatic office, one of the maintenance workers he had befriended on Vel Cathor, who had since been promoted to a junior administrative role. The message just said, "It happened. She signed it. Thought you should know." Marcus read it sitting at his desk in a small room on a frontier station, the kind of room nobody else wanted. Then, he set his tablet down and looked out the viewport at the stars for a while. Aboard the Vel Sora's Reach, the Empress's new flagship, named quietly after herself in the tradition of her line, the treaty signing took place in a formal hall that held representatives from both the Veilthari Empire and the human government. The honor guard that flanked the hall was joint, tall Veilthari soldiers in silver armor, standing beside human soldiers in dark uniforms, side by side, for the first time in history. Empress Vel Sora moved through the hall to the signing table, and paused for a moment before she sat down. She looked at the human soldiers standing at attention along the wall. She studied them the way she had not studied them before, with real attention, real curiosity, without the framework of assumption she had carried for so long. What she saw were people who looked small and soft and unremarkable, people who had no armor in their skin, and no great length of years ahead of them. People who could be broken by things that barely inconvenienced her own guards. People who had shown her, one bloody and impossible 4-minute fight at a time, that none of that told you what you actually needed to know. Her language was very old. In several thousand years of recorded history, the Veilthari had developed words for almost everything. But as she sat down and picked up the pen to sign, she found herself thinking of a word her language had needed to borrow, for the first time, from the species that had earned this moment. Stubborn. She signed her name. The hall erupted in the sounds of two civilizations taking their first real step toward each other. Outside, very far away, on a quiet frontier station, a human sergeant filed his evening report, checked the docking logs one more time, and turned off his desk light.